everyone. Welcome back to English 116. This is our class for Wednesday, the 11th, where we are putting some closure onto our fiction section. And we are preparing for our next unit, which is drama. And we are also focusing on our first formal writing assignment. So, as you know, we started with Citizen Kane and we talked a little bit about the conventions of film. And then we moved forward and we began talking about some of the conventions of short story, with our last short story, at least in this unit, being Popular Mechanics, written in 1981 by Raymond Carver. An example of minimalist writing, so as short and concise as something like Soldier's Home might be, it's nowhere near as concise as something like Popular Mechanics. And the title itself is so interesting. If you were reading the questions at the ending of the story, then you would have noticed that the original title was Mine, which makes sense when we think about the plot of the story. But in terms of Popular Mechanics, popular means common, and one could argue that the story is a common situation. And mechanics, one of the definitions of mechanics are two forces that are working against one another, and that also is applicable to the story. Popular Mechanics is also the name of a magazine that talks about how to fix things and put things together. And this story almost works like an instruction manual about how to break things and take things apart. So the title itself is quite interesting. And you may have noticed that there are no quotation marks in the story. And one of the things that I like to think about the story is about how their dialogue, the man and woman who are basically ending a relationship and fighting about the ownership, for lack of a better word, of their child. That dialogue is one that's so commonplace at the ending of relationships that perhaps no quotation marks are necessary. We use quotation marks to indicate that this is an original statement or idea by a person, but the language that we see used, I'm so glad you're leaving, I'm so glad you're leaving, you son of a bitch, which is a quote, is perhaps the very dialogue that happens time and time again when couples end their relationship. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have quotation marks. And it certainly also makes it difficult to differentiate who's speaking. In the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the welfare of the child, and that's a welfare that is not considered in this story. We get lots of clues and foreshadowing. The setting is quite dark, which sets the tone. We hear that it's getting dark outside as well as inside, that the snow is melting into dark water, slushy water. It's a tiny window that faces the backyard. So all of this sort of sets the scene of entrapment and darkness. The baby picture that they initially argue over is a piece of foreshadowing. The baby picture is an object. And now later, shortly thereafter, they'll be arguing about that baby as if it were a picture. They will shatter a flower pot during their argument, and that is also foreshadowing of how they're going to shatter this child. Flower pot is a live being, or in the flower pot is a flower that's a live being, and they destroy it, which is what they're going to do with the child. And in true form, to understand the story, you really need to understand another story that came long before it. And much like music, pieces of literature will oftentimes be indebted to works that came before them. In this particular instance, it's a biblical story, and the Bible is oftentimes used as literary references. You may or may not be familiar with the biblical story of Solomon, in which two women go to King Solomon and they're both disputing the motherhood of a baby, both claiming that they are the mother. Solomon says that they should literally cut that child in two so that each woman can have half of the baby, that would be the fairest way to proceed. And one of the women steps forward and says, no, let the other woman have the child and I'll go without. And Solomon says to the woman who stepped forward, you must be the biological mother, because only a mother would put her child's self-interest above her own self-interest. That's the moral of the biblical story. What Raymond Carver gives us is a retelling of this story from a 1981 perspective, where divorce was becoming much more commonplace or popular, hence popular mechanics, and where both parents don't put the welfare of the child above their own. And with that last statement, in this manner, the issue was decided. If you've got two parents who are pulling as hard as they can on their child, they literally tear that child in two. Again, it's the biblical story of Solomon with actually tearing that child. From a symbolic perspective, it's supposed to represent what oftentimes happens to children of divorce when they are emotionally torn into two by both parents, with both parents wanting the allegiance of that child and not being willing to share that child. Sometimes also it relates to physical residences where children spend half of a week in one locale, half of the week in another, and again, they feel like they're being split in two. And we have to think about the world in 1981, where not 50% of marriages would end in divorce, which is what we find now. So divorce is much more commonplace now. In fact, it's the expected actually result. It's not the exception; it's the rule. Things would have been very different in 1981. So part of this is commentary about what divorce could do to children, and of course, timeless and universal themes is what divorce still can do to children in 2023. Notice we're never given names, and we had talked about this a little bit with the story, A Sorrowful Woman. It helps to take away individuality, but also universalizes it to lots of different people. And also, we're never told what the couple is arguing about because honestly, it's irrelevant. All that matters is the welfare of the child. So what this means is that if we've put closure onto this particular section, you're hopefully at the place where you're beginning to contemplate what to write your paper about. And as you know, I gave you some options to either talk about canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of literary study. And you could reference Citizen Kane or one of the short stories and talk about why it should or should not, in your opinion, be included in the canon, which means that you're evaluating quality. So you're evaluating things like creativity and whether or not it talks about timeless and universal themes, whether or not it uses language in interesting ways, whether or not it makes social statements, whether or not it can be reread or rewatched and new meaning can be derived from it. Of course, there's no right or wrong answer here if you were to choose this topic. It's more a question of your argumentation. And you would need to use references from the text, whether it be from the short story or from the film, and then basically use that, both quotation and paraphrase. Quotation being exact language, word for word, and then paraphrase being you're putting it in your own words as support to show whether or not something should or should not be included in the canon. And if you didn't want to write on that topic, you could write about contemporary relevance and talk about how either Citizen Kane, as our example of film, or one of the short stories that we've read, still does or does not have contemporary relevance, again, giving the reasons why. And the focus, again, on the text itself. So you don't want to lose control of your paper and start talking about contemporary times. So if you were going to write about the short story Soldier's Home, for instance, you might be very tempted to talk about the events of the last several days in the Middle East. And ultimately, the focus of your paper should not be about what's happening now in the Middle East. It's about ultimately what's happening to Krebs and his story. Though certainly you can reference our contemporary times. Now, if you didn't want to choose either one of these topics, and both of these topics require a good amount of thinking and contemplation, and these topics, again, don't have right or wrong answers. It's more about how you've gone through analyzing and thinking about the particular justification for the position that you happen to be taking. You're much like an attorney who's putting together argumentation, and a good attorney can argue either side of the case with the same pieces of evidence. In theory, you could do the same. You could argue either side and submit in both papers and get an equally strong grade. So it's a question of which pieces of evidence are you going to focus on. But if you don't care for either one of these, you can also create your own essay topic. You just want to make sure that you have the topic approved by me and that you are discussing one of the texts in our first unit, which happens to be the fiction section. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the conventions of writing papers. And in terms of writing papers, I've included a handout in the syllabus and other documents folder where you can discuss, if you so wanted to, the conventions of writing a paper from the perspective that I would have been introduced to when I was a college student. This was actually a handout that was distributed to me in my early college days that I've saved all these years. And it basically divides the writing process into 3 steps or stages: the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage. And I know that this is review, and I know that I've talked about some of this previously, but I just wanted to reiterate because now I hope that you are in the midst of writing a paper. And in the planning stage, basically what you are doing is doing just that, planning. And I'm hopeful that you're doing that right now. Now, I had given a suggested due date for the 23rd, which happens to be a Monday. But I've said it should be due around the 23rd-ish. I've got rolling due dates for the paper. The idea here is that the 23rd is approximately midway through the semester. So I'm hopeful that you would have submitted in a paper by that point. That said, again, there are rolling due dates, but I'm beginning to get a little bit anxious if you've gone halfway through the semester and you haven't submitted in a paper. And this paper is a paper that can be rewritten for a higher grade. So once I evaluate it and I return it back to you, then basically, if you're content with your grade, you're done. I evaluate it for grammar and for content. And then I give you some suggestions, and I ask that you incorporate those suggestions into your revision. But if you need further direction, reach out to me and I'll be happy to give you further direction. And that you do a revision and you hand in the revision along with the original graded copy with my comments. And you get the higher of the 2 grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester to submit that. But the sooner the better for everybody involved, for obvious reasons. So you can think of this first paper as a kind of draft, if you so wanted to, a kind of learning exercise. Now, you'll be writing a similar kind of paper for our next unit, which happens to be drama. And for our next unit, what you will be talking about are 3 dramas for eventually your paper, which would be due at the ending of the semester. You get to choose one of the 3 dramas, whether it be Oedipus the King, which is the first drama that we're going to be addressing, or it happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream, which is the second drama that we'll be addressing, or lastly, the third drama we'll be addressing, Raisin in the Sun. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of drama is that dramas are much longer than short stories. So we're going to be spending a good amount of time on each of these dramas, as well as talking about performance and film for each of these dramas. Dramas were ultimately meant to be performed, not read, so we definitely have to talk about performance. But they are usually meant to be performed live, not necessarily performed via film. But of course, logistically, seeing these dramas live would be complex. And this is a film class, so it makes sense that we would be watching film productions and talk about many of the things that we talked about with Citizen Kane, about some of the ways that film manipulates how we get story. So now we've got multiple levels here in terms of how the story is told. It's not just the author, as we saw with short story, but we'll also have the camera person, we'll also have the actors, we'll also have the director, as we had talked about with Citizen Kane, and all of that will influence ultimately our perceptions of that particular version. So that said, we'll watch performances of all 3. And I tell you all of this now because next class we'll start moving into the drama section. And we'll do an introduction, much like we did an introduction to film and an introduction to short story. The good news is that much of the introduction is very similar to the points that we've made thus far. So you can transfer over those ideas into drama. And what would be ideal, though I understand the world isn't always ideal, what would be ideal is that as we are talking about Oedipus the King over several classes, you've already finished reading it in its entirety, and you are at home reading the next drama, which happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. And what would be ideal is when we start seeing Midsummer Night's Dream and talking about it, you've read it in its entirety. So you're at home preparing by reading the last drama in our drama unit, which is A Raisin in the Sun. So that when we begin talking about Raisin in the Sun, and we have several classes devoted to it, you've read it in its entirety, because by this point we'll be talking about paper number 2, which will be very similar to paper number 1. A 4 to 5 page paper where I'll ask you to identify a drama that you think either should or should not be included in the literary canon and why. Or to talk about a drama or a performance that you think still has contemporary relevance or does not have contemporary relevance and why. Or you can come up with your own paper topic about either the written drama or one of the performances that we're watching, one of the films. But you need to have the topic approved by me. And this paper will be due at the ending of the semester, so you probably wouldn't have time to rewrite it. But the idea is that you would have already learned how to write a paper with your first writing assignment. That said, the second paper also has a rolling deadline. Obviously, you've got to hand it in by the ending of the semester. But if you can get in your second paper early enough, we might be able to negotiate a revision. It just all depends on due dates and how early you can get it in and whether or not it's feasible for me to review it. But definitely everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper if they so elected to do so. So, in terms of thinking about papers, you can see that it's divided into the planning phase, which I'm hopeful you're doing now. The beauty about the planning phase is that it's just that, planning. You don't have to show your ideas to anybody. You don't have to write in any particular format. And I can tell you that most students skip that planning phase and they go straight to the writing phase and they try to write the perfect first sentence and waste a lot of time trying to write the perfect first sentence. So really at this point, spend some time with the planning phase. And then as we move forward, because you're starting early, ideally, then you can begin with the writing. Once you've got the planning done, and hopefully you've done that over a series of days so that you can go back to it, eliminate things, add things, then you can begin to formulate those things into sentences and paragraphs. And then once you've begun to formulate things into sentences and paragraphs, that basically is what you work with in the editing phase. And I can tell you that most students skip the editing phase because they've run out of time and energy. So you want to save something to be able to devote to trying to write the strongest sentences possible that are concise and clear. I had a very wise professor in college once say that a piece of writing is never done. You just have to submit it in at one point. And I think that's quite true. You could spend months or years working on your writing. We don't have that kind of luxury of time. Obviously, what you want to do is to try to make the strongest sentences possible based on the time limitations that you have. So I'm hopeful that by this point in the semester that you have begun actually constructing a paper, thinking about what topic you might be discussing, and also thinking about what questions you might have about the paper. And in terms of just some of the conventions of writing, and I understand this is probably review for many of you, and that I've also talked about some of this as well, we basically have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And in the introductory paragraph, this is where you give your thesis, your main point. And I'm well aware you may not know what your main point is until you've actually started to do some writing. And you need to backtrack. And you may need to read what you've written thus far, summarize it in a sentence or two, and then plug it into your introduction. And that would be your thesis. You can work backwards. I myself have done that. But you should have a main point, and your introduction is where you list the author, where you list the text, or you list the name of the film, and you list the director. So it should be clear to the reader what your position is, what it is you're going to be arguing, and which text or texts you're going to be arguing about. And then you've got body paragraphs. And in your body paragraphs, this is where you have your evidence. Again, I basically am paid to take the position of judge. I need to be neutral, and you need to present evidence in order to be able to support your particular position, using both a combination of paraphrase, putting things in your own language, as well as quotation, writing something out word for word. And then you've got a concluding paragraph, which is where you give a sense of closure. You don't add any new details or arguments. This is where you basically give a sense of completion to your writing, where you cue in the audience that you're done. And I understand that the conclusion can be quite challenging because you've already said everything. And you probably are tired at this particular point. You may have even run out of time or energy. So you want to save a little something for the end. Perhaps you can relate or talk about a related work by one of the authors or the director that you happen to be discussing. Perhaps you can relate it to contemporary times. That usually works in a conclusion. But you want to save something. And yes, you can restate what you wrote in your introduction, but you don't want to copy your introduction exactly word for word. But you can remind the reader of what your major points were. Keep in mind that you are writing paragraphs, and a paragraph is 3 or more sentences. No 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, as is discussed in the handout that I had uploaded. So basically, you need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end for each of your paragraphs. Though I'm well aware that there are paragraphs in, for instance, journalism that are shorter than that. But we're not writing for journalism, we're writing for an academic audience. And this is also the expectation that is had for the workplace as well. So this is how you can transfer over these skills. And if you have well-written paragraphs, more often than not, your first paragraph is the topic sentence, which serves to summarize what the paragraph is about. So in theory, you can read all of the first sentences and get a kind of skeletal outline of what your paper is about. You can even try this with one of your textbooks, though textbooks are notoriously poorly written. But in theory, you should be able to read the first paragraphs of your, or the first sentences of all of the paragraphs in your chemistry book and get a kind of outline. And thinking a little bit about the idea of a paragraph is supposed to deal with the complete thought or complete idea. And that's determined based on your opening sentence, your topic sentence, how broad or how specific you want your idea to be. A sentence basically just expresses a complete thought. So if you are going through looking for grammar issues, you have to read each sentence as an independent unit and ask yourself, does this sentence make sense by itself without any of the sentences beforehand and afterwards? And this is how you can find grammatical mistakes. In fact, as the handout suggests, and I also suggest, you might want to read your paper backwards. And what that allows you to do is to basically concentrate on the sentences, not on the content of the paper itself, because obviously, if you're reading backwards, it won't make sense. And you can ask yourself, does this sentence make sense? Could I go to somebody in the hallway and say something like, I went home? And that sentence does make sense. It expresses a complete thought, as opposed to the sentence, because I went home. That does not express a complete thought. And the reason why is because suggests that additional information is needed. And usually you'll find that information in the following sentence, or perhaps in the sentence previous. But again, in terms of reading sentences for grammar, you need to focus on the exact sentence itself, not on the sentences beforehand or afterwards. Punctuation is merely to help clarify meaning, something that we take for granted when we listen to someone. So take ending punctuation for a statement like sit down. If we were using a period, it would be sit down. If we were using a question mark, it would be sit down. And if we were using an exclamation point, it would be sit down. Now you can hear the differences in my voice when we're having conversation, but you can't hear those differences when you're reading. So that's really all that punctuation is doing, is it's telling the reader how to read a sentence. The comma is merely a pause, and it's usually a pause to emphasize something that follows afterwards, or the natural pauses that we would take when we take a breath. And yes, there are mechanical grammatical rules of when you use commas and when you use particular pieces of punctuation. But if you can train your ear to listen to be able to hear when something sounds right or wrong. I liken it to listening to music, that you may not be able to read music, but you can probably hear when an incorrect note is sounded. And basically, that is your cue that something is wrong. And if you can correct it, then you don't really need the grammatical explanation unless you're going to be an English teacher. And certainly, if that's the case, then you need to understand the rules. That the sentence I gave you, because I went home, is a dependent clause. That it has a subject and it has a verb, but it does not express a complete thought because it is dependent on additional information because of the word because. The verb is I went home. In this instance, went is the verb. The action, the subject is I, who or what is performing the action. I went home is an independent clause because it has a subject verb, expresses a complete idea. Because I went home is a dependent clause. It has a subject and a verb, but it does not express a complete idea. And that language is useful if you're trying to explain an error in a sentence. But the reality is that as long as you can hear when you're proofreading your paper, because I went home is not a complete sentence. And you can correct it so that you can just change the sentence to I went home or add additional information to the sentence. Because I went home, I missed the meeting, then you're fine. So I encourage you to read your papers out loud, to listen to the sounds of the sentences, because oftentimes you can identify errors and correct them without necessarily having lots of grammatical explanations accompanying that. That's usually the first way I deal with grammar. I can hear it, whether it's right or wrong, and then, of course, I can explain it afterwards. Now, if you wanted additional review for all of this, I have a couple of websites to suggest to you, and they are in the notes below under writing papers. The first is Purdue OWL, which you might have heard of previously from other English classes. It's a great site that was put out by Purdue University, which talks about the conventions of how to put together a paper, from the early stages, generating ideas, to the very end, formatting, which is basically, it should be typed in double space with 1-inch margins. This is included in our syllabus, by the way, for formatting. And that you should include a separate sheet that is a title page that lists the title, your name, my name, the due date. Again, that's included in our syllabus. But that also is included in the MLA, which I hope is something you've heard of before. The Modern Language Association System. They are the ones who come up with the rules for writing in the humanities. This also includes languages, and this also includes us. And there are different rules for different subjects. So you might be familiar with the APA, American Psychological Association. But those are rules for the sciences. So you don't want to mix up the rules with the different subjects. And we are using MLA, which means that you are using parentheses at the ending of a quote. This is something that I'll talk about further in our next class. And then within the parentheses, you're indicating the least amount of information necessary in order to be able to find that quote. And again, Purdue OWL talks about all of this. And Purdue made their site accessible to the general public. You don't have to be a student of Purdue in order to get all of this information. So it's a wonderful resource. But another wonderful resource is the GCC library, and some students forget. And the GCC library is well aware you'll be writing papers. And they have a link on the library site about how to write papers, including how to document, how to quote, which is something that I'll be talking about again in further depth next class. So I've given you that link as well. And also next class, we will begin talking about Introduction to Drama. And while I am not able to find some of the textbook information for free online, I have been able to find the dramas thus far for free. Our first one being Oedipus the King. And you can see in the notes below that I have included a link to Oedipus the King, though of course that is also included in our textbook as well. Next class we'll talk about Oedipus being such an old play, 430 BC from Greece. So obviously, we're reading a translation into English. So each version of Oedipus that appears, whether it be online or in different textbooks, they're usually different translations. We'll talk about some of the challenges that presents after we talk about the introduction to writing, about drama and reading drama. How is that similar to and different from writing and reading about a short story? And of course, how do we apply the elements of watching film to the dramatic performances that we are going to be seeing? So basically, at this point, where we're at is hopefully we've put some closure onto our fiction section. You're beginning the drama section, and you're beginning to seriously think about paper number one. So today's attendance question that I have for you that would be due on Friday, the 13th, and the date does not escape me here, the significance of that is, do you have any questions at this point about paper number one? And certainly you can say no. And if it turns out that that's the case, just say no, and that would count for your attendance. But at this point, I'm hopeful that you are seriously contemplating paper number one. So again, the question is for your attendance, which is due on Friday. Do you have any questions about paper number one? And if so, what are those questions? I'll try to address them to the best of my ability. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So this will give you an idea of what we would continue to do right now, which is to talk about paper number one and some of the questions that individuals might have. Again, I haven't put closure onto talking about paper number one because I do want to talk about quotation, but I want us to begin thinking about paper number one, noting that next week we can begin talking about what I had scheduled for today, which was the elements of drama. The good news is that I know I can combine that with what was scheduled for Monday's class on the 16th, which is the study of Sophocles. So that'll get us back on track again. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well. What I wanted you to do was to consider rather seriously what to do with your first paper, whether or not you wanted to tackle the idea of canon, whether or not a work you think has enough quality to be studied in an academic setting, and if so, why? Or to talk about contemporary relevance. Obviously, everything we've seen and read is from the past. And do you think something still has contemporary relevance or doesn't? And the reasons why. Or you can create your own topic. So think about something like Citizen Kane, for instance. You know, a very common topic would be to talk about the significance of Rosebud in the film. So that would be a possibility. Many of the short stories that we've read have questions at the ending of the short stories that could perhaps provide possible topics. Certainly my discussions have provided possible topics. So talking about the significance of the title, Rose for Emily, for instance, or how Miss Emily lives in a dead past could be a possibility as well. Though if you are going to write about your own topic, you do want to touch base with me about what that topic is and why you're pursuing that topic. So again, I hope you're doing well. I know I've given you quite a bit of information here, but I encourage you at this point to look at the handout in our syllabus and other documents folder and to read that over. And I'll be addressing that next class, specifically some of the conventions about writing and also some of the conventions about quoting. Take care. Bye-bye.